what we're talking about today is really the kind of, is this a new post-Cold War order? Richard, we'll get into it now. Sadly, I think the war in Ukraine is a manifestation of what's been going on for years. And so, Richard, maybe you could just open it up with that maybe this is an example of the new world order, but this is what's been brewing for years.
See them, everybody goes away happy rather than the reverse, but I'll do my best, but thank you very much. In Washington, when you do foreign policy, people always claim that the world's at an inflection point, and political leaders always claim we're always at an inflection point, right? Everything is changing so fast, it's more complicated than it's ever been. I think this time we actually are at an war. The new German chancellor announced that Germany would spend 100 billion euros this year on defense and then commit to 2% of GDP in the future. That will make Germany have the third biggest defense budget in the world after the United States and China, bigger than Russia, bigger than India, bigger than Japan. You can look at the fact that Finland and Sweden, which said for decades and decades that they did not want to be part of NATO, suddenly are on the verge of joining NATO as soon as this summer. So Putin wanted a smaller NATO, one that wouldn't expand. He's going to get a bigger one and one that does expand. My favorite example is the Swiss. They've only been neutral for 500 years, but the Swiss, for God's sakes, came out really in violation of their neutrality principles in a way, and immediately froze Russian assets in the wake of this. It adopted the EU sanctions. They could no longer kind of be on the fence in Europe. So you can look around Europe and see real changes, not just in terms of the response that's happening right now, but where these countries are going to go in the future, the way they're sort of charting their economic and their security policies into the future. And then you can look around other places as well. So in Japan is never a big fan of sanctions, but it put all the same sanctions, including freezing the central bank assets of Russia, on Russia, started sending equipment to the Ukrainians, and former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who still leads the biggest LDP faction in Japan, sort of broke the nuclear taboo in Japan, which is so strong, by saying, well, Japan might have to think about developing its own nuclear weapons program, and things like that. Now, that was kind of quashed by Prime Minister Kishida, but it shows how fast things are changing, and it's because for the Japanese, this is a dress rehearsal for China-Taiwan, and so they're watching the way the world responds. Singapore would join the sanctions. I believe this is the first time Singapore has joined non-UN sanctions since the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in the late 1970s. So you can start to look around, and big parts of the world are changing their disposition on some of these key things. And I think a lot of this is going to last. I don't think this is just, for a few weeks or a few months or, until things start to die down on the war. I think that this is a shift in the way that many of these countries are seeing their security interests. And of course, we can talk about it, but Russia and China having kind of gotten together in this quasi-alliance is a pretty big deal too. And they announced that during the Olympics, right, the same month that Putin decided to invade Ukraine.
Yeah, they at least waited, right?
Yeah.
We'll probably start just with the war itself, and then move on to the broader kind of geopolitical impacts. Backing it up, a good few months before we get to February 24th, can you talk about, for weeks and weeks, the U.S. intelligence agencies, the Biden administration saying this is a real threat, we think there's a very good possibility to do it. In particular, it didn't really make big headlines for a while, but our director, Bill Burns, our director of the CIA, former Deputy Secretary of State, went to Moscow, had a meeting with Putin. It wasn't necessarily face-to-face, but can you talk about what is known to have come out of that meeting? I think that was in November, was it?
Yeah.
That really maybe just absolutely put this in stone, that this is real, this is happening, Putin's mind is fixed, and we're in a bad position.
Yeah, so it was late September, early October of last year that the U.S. government picked up the intelligence that Putin was planning to invade Ukraine and developing a plan in the Russian General Staff to do that. And at the beginning, they were like, that's insane. And so it kind of can't be real. And then they pick up more and more intelligence saying the same thing. So Bill Burns, who runs the CIA, had been the U.S. ambassador to Russia when he was in the Foreign Service. And so they sent him over for a meeting with Putin. Bill got over there, and then Putin is just absolutely crazed about COVID, which clearly no one in this audience is, because we're all sitting in a super spreader, kind of, packed like sardines environment. But if you saw any of these meetings that Putin did with these foreign leaders, where they have the world's longest table and one on each side, so that's how it was. So Bill was not allowed to meet. So he went all the way to Moscow, and he did a video conference with Putin, but from the Russian foreign ministry. And so he had this meeting with Putin, confronted him. We know what's going on, and here are the kind of consequences of that kind of action. And Putin did not deny that he was intending to invade Ukraine, but he said some things that I think are pretty telling. So one was that, as was clear to everybody, Ukraine was moving out of the Russian orbit and sort of drifting toward the West. It wanted to join NATO. It wasn't going to join NATO, but there was some forms of security cooperation. It wanted to join the EU. It wasn't going to join the EU, but there's more economic cooperation. So in terms of its sort of national identity and its alignment, it was drifting away from Russia and toward the West, which Putin thought was just sort of an unacceptable risk and threat to Russia. And what he said was, I am running out of time. Not Russia is running out of time, but Vladimir Putin, am running out of time. And apparently what he meant by this was, for him, he really believed that, or believes that Ukraine aligned with the West as a security threat. He really believes that it's not a real country, that the Russian and Ukrainian people are one. And so reunification with those people was going to be a legacy project for him. Russia had weak leaders before him that weren't willing to do what was necessary to bring that about. They were likely to have weak leaders after him that were unlikely to do what was necessary to bring that about, and it was going to have to happen on his watch. He wasn't getting any younger, and if he stood by and did nothing, then ultimately it would become too late, and Ukraine would drift fully into the Western. And so he said, I've tried many different things. I tried diplomacy. I offered them loans. I tried all this other stuff, and I have no choice. He kept saying, I have no choice. And now he started saying that publicly. We had to do this. We had to do this. We had no choice. And apparently what he means by this is, again, they tried diplomacy to get Ukraine to align itself with Russia. They tried providing billions of dollars of loans. They tried covert operations. They tried these mini wars. They tried this, none of that worked. And so the only thing left was a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The thing that was so odd about all of this, when you talk about the intelligence, though, is so the administration picked up really specific, granular intelligence about what the Russians were going to do, where they were going to do it, what units were going to, and they actually nailed it. I mean, they made this up public, and even when the Ukrainians and the Russians and the Europeans were all saying it's not going to happen like this, the U.S. was right, but there was a gap in the intelligence, and the gap in the intelligence was they could not get their hands on the long-term plan. So, let's say that Russia, when it invaded Ukraine and tried to immediately take Kiev, had actually been successful. Okay, so then what do? You either occupy the country with the Russian military, and Americans know something about what it's like to occupy a country that doesn't want to be occupied by you. You get an insurgency on your hands. Or you put your puppet in, and then you go home, but then you get a popular uprising against the puppet, and you're right back where you started. So, how does this actually work? What's the long-term plan? They couldn't get their hands on a long-term plan, and what they have since concluded is there never was a long-term plan. It just was a short-term plan, which seems crazy to us because, of course, no country would ever invade another country, topple its government, occupy the country without a long-term plan for what to do with it. But, those things do happen.
A great point. And related to it, obviously some of the European leaders in December, January, even early February might have been downplaying things. We don't know what's going to happen. Macron's talked about negotiations in around the time. But is it, I know you can, some things you cannot discuss, but is it pretty fair to assume that for many, many weeks, the end of last year and into this year, the administration was working extremely hard to build this coalition in Europe and Japan and South Korea and Australia to have sanctions and a formulated, solid, unified force in place. Because the speed at which it happened, literally 2 days after the invasion, I think it blew most of the world away. That Europe has a hard time agreeing upon the voltage of vacuum cleaners. That they're all unified on basically how to respond to Russia.
Yeah, so that's what they did. I mean, the thing that by getting first a hold of the intelligence in September, and then the fact that the military buildup happened in plain sight for everybody to see for months and months and months, it gave the administration a decent amount of time to go around and start to enlist basically an anti-aggression coalition and come up with the plans for what to do. And so they basically had contingency sanctions measures that they had pre-prepared and gotten other countries to sign on. But I will say that there was things that they couldn't get other countries to sign on that, within days of the invasion, those countries flipped. So, for example, if you're following this stuff, the SWIFT messaging system for global financial transactions, upon the invasion, the Americans had tried to push them, okay, we're going to kick Russia off of SWIFT, and the Europeans weren't having it. 48 hours or 72 hours after the invasion, suddenly they were for that. And, and other things have changed too. I mean, the administration they had to carve out of the sanctions for oil and gas. Then a couple of weeks, the U.S. was banning the import of Russian oil and gas, and now the Europeans are talking about doing it. So things changed, but they had a decent amount of time, so they kind of prepared the groundwork, and they also did that in weapons to the Ukrainians. I mean, the Ukrainians themselves, at a political level, I think we're in a little bit of denial. I mean, Zelensky called up the Ukrainian reservists 1 day before the Russian invasion, which, Putin called up reservists to serve in Ukraine months before that. So, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense could see this was happening, but Zelensky was afraid it would spread panic. And after all, who knows, maybe they won't invade and all of this. And so they were kind of caught. But the administration did a bunch of work in advance.
And obviously, looking at plans that spectacularly backfire, Putin obviously has a great disdain for NATO for many, many years. Never wanted Ukraine to join. They almost certainly weren't going to join anytime soon anyway. But NATO is the most unified it's ever been since the Cold War. You mentioned Germany, the most militarized it's been since World War II. Historical reasons for that, obviously. But can you talk about the realities of NATO going forward? I mean, it's unheard of that now Sweden and Finland almost certainly would not even considered it a few months ago. That's something that's favored by the population. It may be considered by both governments. But if Finland and Sweden were to join, what does that mean for NATO? Finland adds about an 800-plus mile border with Russia, probably doubles the miles of that you would have to defend with regards to the eastern edge of NATO. What's realistic for Sweden and Finland and the future of NATO?
Yeah, so alliances like NATO are essentially an insurance policy against threats that may or may not ever materialize. And the desire for an insurance policy goes way up when a threat really does materialize. And the difference today between Ukraine, not in NATO, that is being invaded by Russia, and Poland on its border that is in NATO and not being invaded by Russia is about as stark as you can get. And that is pretty convincing. I mean, for the first time in history after the invasion of Ukraine, majorities of both Sweden and Finland favored NATO membership. They had never done that until that point. And the point is pretty obvious. They want the protections that NATO can give. But the Russians invade, you'd like to call the Pentagon for help, if you can. And so it's pretty straightforward. The question for the rest of the alliance is, do we want to bring in additional countries and extend a security guarantee to them? Are they going to be net security providers or consumers and things like that? I mean, both Sweden and Finland have some advanced military capabilities and actually have been working with NATO and intelligence ways with the United States and others for a long time. It's really been a reticence of the political systems in both of those is the reason why, and of course, the geography and the history of Finland, where it sits next to Russia, they've been the reasons why they have been members of NATO. But I think I think NATO will have pretty open arms when it comes to Finland and NATO and Sweden. That, you know, if the way things look is the way things will be, then if you're in NATO, you don't get invaded, and if you're not in NATO, like Georgia and Moldova and Belarus and Ukraine, then you're going to have Russian troops on your soil. Then the most dangerous point is basically from now until they actually join, because once you join, you get the protections. Before that, you've antagonized the Russians, who have a strong interest in not seeing you join or taking any actions that they might take before such time as you can actually call the Pentagon. So that's kind of the issue right now. But you'd like to say, well, Putin would be crazy to be bogged down in Ukraine and then try to start a war in Finland, and that would be true, but it doesn't mean he wouldn't do it.
And just looking again at the region before we get a wider scope, in terms of NATO, there are concerning countries like Viktor Orban and Hungary, obviously, but the largest by population member of NATO, obviously Turkey, a crucial geopolitical location for us for many reasons, but also especially under Erdogan, a troubled relationship where he back and forth, on again, off again relationship with Putin. Erdogan, his own authoritarian, kind of impulses that are very concerning. But with regards to this war, can you talk about, Turkey and the possibility of actually stopping Russian naval ships going through the Bosphorus to the Black Sea? We noted today, you guys might have seen a huge Russian, guided missile cruiser, the Moscow, was sank today. The Ukrainians said it was from 2 Neptune missiles. The Russians said it was a fire, which maybe happened, but it seems like a
total coincidence.
Really bad timing.
Total coincidence. Just happened in the middle of a war.
But can you talk about the role of Turkey and also the kind of the a really huge role that they play indirectly is the TBT drones that Turkey supplied that have been responsible for taking out a lot of these armored columns of the Russians.
Yeah, so the Turks, like you're saying, Erdogan has had a very up and down relationship with Russia. The Turks have been more coherent with the rest of NATO and tougher on the Russians, I think, than most people anticipated before all this began, in a couple of ways. So one, they invoked the authorities under the Montreux Convention to stop vessels transiting the Bosphorus into the Black Sea and things like that. They've hosted, they didn't mediate, but they've hosted the diplomatic talks between Ukrainian and Russians and sort of exhorted them to come to some sort of agreement. And like you're saying, they are selling to Ukraine the only missile-armed drones that Ukraine has. So the United States, for example, is not selling that or giving Ukraine drones that are equipped with Hellfire missiles and things like that. There are other kinds of drones that we're supplying, but the Turks have been supplying these, and those have had a pretty significant effect because, if you followed any of this for a long time, there was a 40-mile convoy north of Kiev that was on the road, and it couldn't go off the road because it was too much mud, and it was kind of a nightmare. It was like the world's longest traffic jam, and they just started hitting that from the ground, but also with drones. They've taken out a number of Russian, assets with those drones, and so it's not been a game changer, but it's certainly been a capability that the Ukrainians would probably be in a different place without. And so, where does that leave Turkey on all this? Well, kind of in the middle, leaning toward the Ukrainian position, not like Britain or the United States, but not like the Turkey of a year ago when it comes to Russia either. So, as usual, Erdogan sort of forging his own way. And
lastly, with regards to the current state of the war itself, obviously Putin, is very proud of himself for his quiet takeover of Crimea. There are no little green men, and then we celebrate it later. There are no Russians in fighting the Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk. Those are just Russians who happen to be on vacation, all that sort of stuff. But since 2014, there's been 8 years of a simmering and sometimes boiling war between Ukraine and its east with Russian and Russian-backed separatists. In an odd way, is it ironic that this maybe really came back to bite Putin in the rear, and that gave the Ukrainians 8 years to develop competencies, to develop combat experience, to become more efficient, and maybe more importantly, to learn and understand Russian tactics in a way that, if that hadn't happened, they may not have been so effective with the invasion now.
Yeah, that's part of it. Another part of it is, Ukraine wasn't really getting military aid from the West before 2014, but post 2014, Ukraine has been the third biggest recipient of U.S. military assistance in the world after Israel and Egypt, which most people didn't really know, but there's been a lot going over to them. So when the war broke out, Javelin are these anti-tank missiles. And when the war broke out, the Ukrainians have been supplied with one Javelin for every Russian tank across the borders. And, you see where those Russian tanks tend to be right now. They're, still in Ukraine, but without the people in them. And so, there has been, it was it catalyzed. So what you're saying is right, but it also catalyzed this assistance project. And of course, the United States was working with the Ukrainian military, sharing intelligence and training them. This is, of course, also part of what incited Putin's concern about all of this. So it cut more than one way, but it's certainly the thing. It turns out also that Putin seems to have concluded wrongly that the Russian military had taken its own great strides in its effectiveness, particularly since 2008 when they invaded Georgia and they didn't do all that well. They did big military modernization plans, spent billions of dollars and all this other stuff. But corruption in Russia seems to have eaten away a bunch of those things. So I'll give you one example of this. So my younger brother works for USAID, the aid part of the U.S. government. He just came back a little while ago from 2.5 weeks in eastern Poland, where he was giving out aid to the refugees coming across the border. And so it has been mystifying to everybody at the beginning. Russia's got all these cyber weapons and electronic warfare, except, there's more Ukrainian websites up now than there are Russian. I mean, people are posting stuff all day long. People are using their cell phones. Like, it wasn't supposed to be this way. So, why is the cell phone network working? Why is the communications network working? Why can people still access the internet and everything? Well, the Russians carried into Ukraine their encrypted radios, but the contractor who supplied these basically supplied a bunch of crappy radios, and somebody was skimming money off the top. So there were 2 encrypted channels, neither of which worked, and they didn't know that until they got in the field. There was one unencrypted channel, but of course, to use that, they had to keep parts of the electromagnetic spectrum going. So they started doing that. Well, the Ukrainians listened into everything they have and started shooting everybody by triangulating the location. So they said, okay, well, we can't use our unencrypted channels. So what did they decide to do? Use their cell phones. So they started talking to each other. So generals are talking to people in the field in Ukraine with their cell phones. They start triangulating that. And then the Ukrainian national telecom operator got the idea, we're just going to cut off any cell phone that has a Russian prefix. So about a week ago, the ability of most of the Russians to communicate by cell phones in Ukraine disappeared. And the reason why they haven't cut off all of the cell signals and all that is because they were using them, and they wouldn't be able to communicate without them. And so this was sort of the vaunted, Russia cyber meddlers and all this other kind of stuff. So that's kind of where they are.
And sadly, in some places, probably like Mariupol, the Russians have absolutely obliterated the city and probably knocked out a lot of those cell towers too.
Yeah.
I guess. Before we return to China, obviously, Richard's incredible. I love Richard because he can talk about any part of the world, but really his bread and butter is China, is East Asia. You mentioned Japan. Japan and South Korea, obviously not members of NATO, but the U.S. has separate, similar defense agreements with both Japan and South Korea for that we would come to their defense. Japan and South Korea got on board very quickly to be on the same page, the Europeans, same page in the United States, the Canadians, the Australians, but they're doing it with the presumption and the assumption that this gets to a much higher level with China, probably a much more effective military, an economy 10 times the size of Russia, that you Europeans will come to our aid, 3, 5, 7 years down the line. How realistic is that? And do you think it's I suppose, hopeful thinking or realistic that they will get that support if they need it down the line?
Well, one of the reasons why they came in with the sanctions and have been so sort of strong on this is because they want the learning that goes on following this episode to be, if you decide you would like to take your neighbor's territory by force, the world, not just your neighbors or a few concerned countries, but the world's biggest economies are going to exact a very significant price. And they don't think that that's going to necessarily change the way Putin wages this war, but it may make the next guy think harder about whether the next guy is willing to pay such a high price for doing something like that. And the next guy they have in mind is China and Taiwan especially. And so, they and the Chinese are all watching this to say, well, does this really turn out like Crimea or Hong Kong or Eastern Ukraine before, or South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia, where, people were outraged with some sanctions, but everybody got on with their lives and the Russians kept those places, and China got Hong Kong and all this stuff? Or is this categorically different? And what they're trying to do is help make this categorically different so that this dissuades the Chinese from, potentially moving on Taiwan. That's a different matter than whether the Europeans would come to the aid of the Taiwanese, for example, if the Chinese attack Taiwan. That, I think, is a huge question mark, and I don't know that anybody, including the Europeans themselves, have the answer. I mean, if you mean fighting, no, they won't do that. But if you mean sanctions, even there it's sort of hard to say, because, I could imagine the Chinese concluding from this two completely different things. I could imagine them saying, oh God, well, Putin's reckless, and okay, he's gonna, suffer a 10 or 15% drop in his GDP this year, and he may default on his sovereign debt, and he's got all these bodies coming back to Russia, and he thinks that's all worth it, but maybe that's not worth it to us. This is the same kind of thing. On the other hand, I could see them saying, well, what the world has done to Russia, they just wouldn't do to us. Because for all these sanctioning countries, Russia's not the number 1 or 2 trade partner for any of them. They care about Russian oil and gas, but Russia doesn't really make anything else. It's not really a source of international capital. Completely the opposite is true of China. So every country would hurt itself far more by doing to China economically what these countries have done to Russia. Again, it doesn't mean they won't do it, but I could see the Chinese potentially concluding that they would. So where does that kind of net out and leave you? I don't know. We'll have to do another one of these seminars. Prediction's a hard thing.
Obviously, China, completely different ballgame. I think they're the number 1 trading partner for about 140 countries in the world out of 190, which is staggering. Yeah. So, economic sanctions are way different to think about in those regards. You talked about earlier, with China. Obviously, Putin was kind enough to wait for his big brother, President Xi, to finish the Winter Olympics in Beijing before he invaded. But China is obviously studying this very, very closely. What do you think they're taking from this? How does this impact or maybe push off any potential plans that might have for Taiwan? And what lessons do you think they're currently learning, or are they just waiting to see where we are in 1 month, 6 months?
So when the administration first got the intelligence about the Russian plans, they sent Bill Burns over there. But the other thing was they were looking for someone who had better relations with the Russians than us that might be able to talk some sense into Putin and to the Russians and sort of say, look, that you're on the verge of making a potentially catastrophic mistake. So they went to the Chinese. And they laid out for the Chinese, the U.S. diplomats had just laid out for the Chinese, here's what we understand, based on our intelligence capabilities, the Russians have in mind. We're asking you, we're sharing this with you, and we're asking you to talk to the Russians and kind of see if you can walk them back. They then subsequently picked up through eavesdropping capabilities, the Chinese talking to the Russians saying, the Americans are trying to get us to talk you out of this war that you're planning, but we're not going to do that. So we just wanted to let you know. The Chinese didn't know that Putin was going to go to Kiev, but they did know that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. They had one request, which was wait till the Olympics are done, which he did. So he invaded the day after the Olympics were done, so as not to ruin the show there in Beijing. And, you know, people who watch this have sometimes since the beginning of this war sort of characterized China as like, you know, on the fence. They're not on the fence. They are fully behind the Russian position here. And, you know, they announced this big quasi-alliance and sort of Putin and Xi put out a huge manifesto in January about kind of the way the world should be once, you know, they work together. And it was, you know, nobody's going to harass them about democracy or human rights. And, you know, there's not going to be an American-led global order. And there's not going to be more alliances in Asia. And NATO's not going to expand more. And all this other kind of, they themselves would define democracy and all these other kinds of things. And so really, you know, but in a way, the Chinese are in a little bit of a bind. I mean, you could imagine the Chinese having a bit of buyer's remorse because, you know, in February, January, when they announced this big kind of quasi-alliance, people thought the Russian military was really capable. And people thought the Russian economy was connected to the world economy. And, you know, suddenly Russia, they're one ally in the world, if you leave out North Korea and Cambodia. The only meaningful kind of ally they have now is being isolated and impoverished, and its military is shown to be much less capable than it was. That's not really what you're looking for when you're looking for like big allies. You want, you know, strong, connected, you know, capable ones. And then this is the opposite. But that hasn't changed at all their position on this. And so, you know, they are using the same talking points as the Russians. They're saying, you know, this war is America's fault. We cornered Putin by expanding NATO. You know, they've even talked about, well, there's 21 biological weapons labs in Ukraine that are run by the CIA. I mean, this kind of Russian stuff, and none of which is true, by the way. And so I think they're together in this, you know, come hell or high water. I think they're linked up on this because they have this similar kind of rejectionist view of American and Western leadership in the world, and they want to sort of restore what they believe are their two countries' rightful places in the world. China's rightful place after a century of humiliation, and Russia's rightful place after the humiliation after the end of the Cold War. You know, to sort of make China and Russia great again.
I'm going to kind of just turn to the audience questions here in a moment, but maybe just a kind of last kind of really big overview question. You know, historically, Richard's a great historian today. He's telling about things about the Japanese negotiations internally with regards to the end of World War II, which I thought was really interesting. Had a great discussion. You know, the 1990s was an incredible time, but it was an exceptional time. I think we see now that with the course of history doesn't stop, change doesn't stop. A world with one power, one global power is truly unique and probably is not going to last. You know, obviously China's already risen, Russia's a different kind of power. Is this something we should just, you know, kind of get used to and realize, you know, the 1990s was an exception, but we're in for the long haul for whatever way you want to call it, a competition between democracies and authoritarianism, between, you know, kind of a new polarized world again, and, you know, is that just kind of where we are, or do you see kind of any ways to kind of, you know, tone down, not necessarily with the Russians, but especially tension with the Chinese in the years to come?
I think this is the way the world is. I think the 90s were a unique time. The Chinese, I mean, go back and even look at some of the pictures of Beijing and Shanghai, even in the 1990s compared to today. I mean, their economy has grown so big, so fast, and they had a different leadership at the time, and it was pre-global financial crisis, after which they, I think, concluded that America's day was sort of done and didn't have responsible global leadership, and China's day has arrived. You put all that together, and China's just got a different, much more assertive, and much foreign policy, and a much more capable, bigger economy and military to go with it. You know, on the Russia side, I mean, it went from the Red Army in 1991 to by 1992, you had Russian military officers who would walk miles back and forth to work because they couldn't afford the gas in their car. I mean, the economy was on its back. The entire Soviet Union obviously broke up. They had huge internal difficulties, and in some ways, this is that they're trying to say you all took advantage of us when we were weak and on our backs, and we're not weak anymore, and we're going to show you that we're not going to be taken advantage of anymore. But I don't think there's any going back to that moment in global history where you had two huge superpowers, then one imploded. You only had one, and the Chinese were sort of biding their time and hadn't really emerged as a major foreign policy power. Those days are done, and so we just have to sort of live with this. But that said, it doesn't mean that you have unalloyed confrontation into the future. I think there will be competition among the United States and China and Russia and other countries well into the future, but you can put boundaries around those things. And part of the challenge now is how do you actually live safely and productively in a world where you're not going back to the 1990s and you do have big countries with very different views about the way the world should be ordered, but you can't fight over all that kind of stuff or we're all going to lose. And that's kind of, I think, the moment that we're at now.
A great question here, but one I wanted to bring up, we didn't have time. Obviously, a huge player we haven't talked about yet. Someone asked, besides cheap oil, why is India aligning itself with Russia and China? And how hard should the U.S. try to bring India, basically back into the fold? I mean, they were never exactly in the fold before, but yeah.
Yeah, India's position, so India voted, it abstained on the votes of the UN that condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it has not embraced the sanctions on Russia, and it also secured a 20% discount on Russian oil exports to India. So it's disappointing, but it's also understandable, I think. A lot of countries that we would like to see line up behind our position on these matters, India and Israel are two good examples, I think are explained by what do these countries care about the most? They care about Russia, Ukraine, but do they care about that the most? And in the case of India, they don't care about that the most. What they care about most right now is securing their border against China, and more than 50% of all of the weapons in the Indian military are Russian-made, require Russian spare parts, require continued Russian, even some maintenance capabilities. And so they worry that if they alienate the Russians too much, then that's going to make their military capability deteriorate, which and will not really do much for Ukraine or Europe, but it could do a lot when it comes to their ability to defend themselves on the border against China. I think on top of that, there's still some lingering kind of non-aligned. India's going to go its own way. Traditions in Indian foreign policy. But you sort of add some of those things together, and I think that explains the India position. I think from the American point of view, and you see that Prime Minister Modi and President Biden had a virtual summit a couple days ago, and it was, despite the fact that the Indians have the position they have, and the Americans have the position they have, the Americans are disappointed in the Indians and stuff. It was all smiles and warm feelings because the underlying kind of pragmatic conclusion on the American side is India matters in Asia with respect to China. It doesn't really matter in Europe with respect to Russia. So you could make this into a total deal breaker between the United States and India, but for what purpose? Whereas if you continue to solidify the U.S.-India relationship in the region where it actually matters, then it could actually generate benefits you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think it's just a pragmatic kind of conclusion that we've all kind of come to.
And then just quickly, in a follow-up to that, obviously, it's about 75 years of independence and the world's largest democracy by far. Relations with the U.S. have not been good. A lot of times during that Cold War period, tighter and deeper with the Russians, especially in regards to defense capabilities and exports and imports. But where we are now, could you maybe talk about the Quad? People who've heard of but basically the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. It's an informal alliance. It's not like NATO. what that means, and at the end of the day, if China was to attack India, I presume the Indians know the Russians are going to take China's side over India's side, right?
Yeah, I think the Indians think that if China attacks India, then India's on its own, and I think they think that because China attacked India 2 years ago and India was on its own. I mean, it was border skirmishes, but they've got some something to show for this. Now, that said, I mean, the United States actually provided some significant military equipment at the height of that border crisis and some of the fighting. But yeah, I mean, Russia is not going to defend India, and if forced to choose, I think Russia would take China's side in such an issue. You know, the Quad, those four countries, it's not an alliance in the sense that NATO is, where, you know, an attack on one is an attack on all. Those countries are not going to fight for each other. But what they do have is a common concern about an Asia or a world dominated by China rather than someone other than China. And that is really the catalyst for them working together in that kind of format. So they're doing things diplomatically, they're sharing technology, they're increasingly talking, they're doing things like joint military exercises and things like that. The Chinese, of course, hate this because they see this as an anti-China kind of coalition, which it is in a lot of ways. So they're not wrong about that. But, you know, that, again, to go back to this point about, you know, insurance policies, threats create the desire for insurance policies. And this is not a categorical insurance policy, but it's better than being off on your own. And so, you know, that's kind of what the Quad's potential is. And I think these countries will only continue to work together a lot more closely.
Two really good questions, kind of looking at you know, Russia and where it is, you know, in the near future, maybe the kind of, you know, shorter term future, who knows beyond that. Despite being the macho man, you know, wrestling bears, you know, riding a horse, you know, without a shirt, or scuba diving and finding lost treasures in the Black Sea.
Talking about me or Putin?
Both of them.
I just want to be clear.
But he's actually...
I've only done half of those things.
Yes, he's actually older than a lot of people around, so he's 70 this year, I think. Related to that, Leslie asks, my expectation is that if Putin dies, resigns, or is disposed, the world will forgive Russia almost immediately. People, especially Americans, have short-term memories. In countries and corporations, the guy at the top completely dominates. So if Putin is gone, the world forgives. I guess kind of comment. And then related to that, Doug asks, can you speculate what Russia will be like in 2 to 5 years? Does Putin survive sanctions and the brain drain?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the people who kind of really look at Russia intently, I think, are struck by the number of people that have gone onto the streets in Russia. So probably been maybe 9, 10,000, 11,000 people that have been arrested, which is never going to materialize into a storming of the Bastille kind of, you know, popular Arab Spring kind of popular uprising. But there's a very significant signaling value of those kinds of protests to the elites, because the price is so incredibly high. Every single person who goes in the street knows they're going to jail. So it's not like living in Washington and there's one more protest because, you know, the cost of protest is so low. There's protests every day. What it is a signal of a very deep discontent with what the existing policy is. That said, you know, it's hard to see how, you know, some of these regimes are like, you know, hollow trees, and they look the same even as they're getting hollowed out, and then suddenly, you know, it turns out they were hollow all along. And so if Putin is somehow deposed or something, we probably won't know until after it actually happens. But I kind of looked at Russian history, I mean, as the only kind of indicator I think that you could really draw on. And, you know, I think it's true that from 1917 until today, there's only been one successful coup in the Soviet Union or Russia, and that was the second coup against Khrushchev that removed him from power. But Lenin died in office, and Stalin died in office, and Brezhnev died in office, and then Andropov died in office, and Chernenko died in office, and Gorbachev, they tried the coup and it didn't work. They were drunk and and literally, they launched a coup and then went drinking and it didn't work, Putin. So the amount of kind of discontent and craziness that can go on in Russia without the population or elites overthrowing their leader is like off the charts. It's not like being, Prime Minister of Italy. They're like, if you wait 6 weeks, there'll be a new one. It's the leader. There's not a tradition of that. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but it's hard to see. So if I was sort of forced to predict where Russia's going to be in 2 or 5 years, it would be Putin is in charge, and Russia is a much more kind of illiberal, repressive place than it was, even a few months ago. And that, the conflicts that we're seeing, including in Ukraine, have probably frozen into another set of so-called frozen conflicts, the likes of what you see in Moldova and Georgia and what you previously saw in Transnistria between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So it's not a very rosy picture, but, that's probably what I would guess.
And just quickly, you mentioned Khrushchev. I know Russia is a democracy of sorts, but in a lot of ways, obviously the Soviet Union, it was not a democracy, but there was a degree of a meritocracy to it. There was a Politburo, there were the highest levels of those officials underneath the ultimate leader who had a degree of influence, who had a degree of communication amongst themselves. And you mentioned Khrushchev and pushed out, but people say, even in this modern quote-unquote democracy, that doesn't really exist for Putin. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it is. It's really one-man rule now. And, in the lead up to the war, there was a bunch of meetings. The Deputy Secretary of State went over to Europe and met with her Russian counterpart, and Russian diplomats kind of doing their thing. And these are people that, they've been in the saddle doing this stuff for, several decades. And to a person, their private message to their American counterparts was, I can be here, I can give you the messages, I can take stuff back, but there's one guy who is deciding this, and it's not here. Everything is being decided in Moscow, and it's being decided by one guy. None of these diplomats had any real authority to negotiate, no authority to make decisions. And Putin, the history books will have to sort of tell how much coronavirus had to do with all this, because he spent 2 years self-isolating to the point where, even his aides, if they were going to come brief him, had to isolate for at least 5 days before they would go to a meeting with him. So he did most of his meetings by secure video conference. Spent a lot of time outside Moscow itself at his dacha outside the city. And with some of these European leaders who have been talking to Putin, he started telling them about how he had been doing all of this archival research about, he had sort of discovered new documents that said Ukraine's not a real country. You never want your president doing archival research on his own and like self-radicalizing because there's nothing better to do. It's just not a good idea. Yet that, how much of that contributed to this, who the hell is to say? But, it was people do say they think Putin's got a different kind of, approach and personality. He's more rigid now, a little more radical on these things than he used to be even a couple of years ago.
And just for the sake of time, we got to almost all of those questions, but there will be 3 or 4 we just may not have time for. I'll give them to Richard, and I know you might hang around. I'll volunteer you. I'll get you something else. If you want to answer a few of those now. But just to ask a few questions again about the Ukraine war, people ask in different ways. What are some of the options you see, coming from it? How could it maybe de-escalate? What are everybody's trying to figure that out? But just a few of these together. Ed asked, has the U.S. done as much as they should to help Ukraine, or has Biden's fear of World War III been overblown? Related to that, Rob asked, could you elaborate on the different approach to Russia's invasion of Crimea and the current war? And Matt lastly asked, do you believe that Ukraine could actually prevail if this goes on for a while?
Okay, so has the U.S. done as much as it should? I think there's still more stuff that we can and should do on the weapons front, and I think we will do. There's a lesson there's a lesson both in what we're doing and there's the lesson on when you do it. So like I said, Ukraine had been a major recipient of U.S. military assistance, but it was small arms stuff. I mean, Javelin and some, they started providing some anti-aircraft and small arms, things like that. The lesson here, not just for Ukraine, for Taiwan, is if you want a country that's going to fend off an invader to have tanks and howitzers and armored personnel carriers and anti-aircraft system, you got to give them that stuff way before the invasion. You don't try to get that stuff in after the invasion and pass it off to them at the border, which is what we're doing now, and is a hell of a lot better than not doing it. But it's not optimal, shall we say? And so, they call it the Porcupine Strategy. Try to make a smaller country into a porcupine, so that if somebody's going to try to swallow it, it's going to be so painful to them that they decide not to do it. And at least in retrospect, and I think even at the time, there was a strong case to do more on the defensive weapon side to Ukraine than was done. But there was this fear of escalation, right? Like, we're going to elicit from Russia precisely the thing that we're trying to avoid, because the Russians are going to think that, Ukraine in the future is only going to get more capable weapons. And so if they're going to go, they got to go now, and all this. So there were reasons, but I don't think those reasons ultimately should have been dispositive. On the question about Crimea and the difference, so Crimea, there was no fighting. The Ukrainians didn't fight for Crimea. The Russians moved in with special operations forces that weren't wearing insignia, said that they weren't Russian, and basically did a covert operation to seize key points in Crimea. The Ukrainian military was based there, but then they essentially took the Crimean parliament and at gunpoint had a resolution passed asking for an independence referendum. And then they held the independence referendum, and surprise, surprise, 99% of Crimeans who, until the day before had been Ukrainians, voted to be Russians. And I wonder how they like that now. But it was not a free and fair referendum, but it was sort of done under coercion. And then the Russians told the Ukrainians, who military was stationed in the barracks there, okay, you got to go, because it's now Russian territory, not Ukrainian. The Ukrainians could have chosen to fight, but they thought that they were going to not win, and so they retreated across the border into Ukraine proper, and so Crimea passed from Ukrainian control to Russian control without fighting. This is obviously completely different because it's been a full-scale invasion of the country, and as everybody knows, the fighting has been incredibly intense. What was the third question?
It was along those lines. Sorry, I don't remember myself.
You don't remember?
Yeah, shit. And related to that, just to kind of, I'll just close it.
Okay.
I don't.
All right. No third question.
The third thought, because
how's it going to end?
Yeah.
That thing. How does this end? Yeah, we should have stopped at 2. So actually, now I see
the next hour.
And now I see why you couldn't remember the third question, or I couldn't either, because it doesn't have an answer. So how does this end? This is the question, of course, about this whole thing. No one has the answer to this. Putin, I think, believes he has the answer, which is that he wins. And I don't think that. I mean, Putin clearly would have liked to take Kiev, but I don't think that he believes this is going terribly badly from his point of view, because the level of fighting in Ukraine's east over the next 2 weeks is probably going to be at a level that we haven't even seen yet so far in intensity and brutality. What I think the Russians could do, this is speculative, but it lines up with some of the stuff we're already seeing, is to claim that this was never about Kiev, and it was never about all of Ukraine. This was always about the east of Ukraine and the Russian-speaking regions there, and stopping genocide and all that, and about the south along the Black Sea. And they seize the area from northeast Ukraine all the way down the Donbass, but more territory there along the south and the Black Sea, possibly including Odessa. And if they do that, then and try to annex that or recognize it as an independent Eastern Ukraine or whatever, then they could go to Zelensky and say, okay, we've got this territory, we're occupying this territory, and the war stops now if you want, And if the war stops now, you keep Kiev and you keep Lviv and your government stays in power and people stop dying, but you've got a landlocked, isolated, basically Western Ukraine that is all there is. And Zelensky would have to decide what to do about that. And that would sort of line up with the narrative they're trying to peddle at home in Russia with, they still deny that they were fighting in Kiev and things like that. But who knows? I mean, so that's one possible scenario for how this ends. There's the sort of, Hail Mary pass or the sort of hopeful scenario that I know a lot of my friends who watch this stuff very closely have is that the Ukrainians are just going to defeat the Russians. That, at some point, Putin will say, oh, this is just, the costs are too high, I'm not winning, I'm just going to get out and we'll go back to the status quo ante and Ukraine. And it's possible, but I just don't see that happening. I mean, I just don't think that Putin can get out of this without having a win, as he might define it, that he can then take to his own people. And the problem is, if you look at the sort of military tactics here, the fighting there was a reason why no one could figure out how the Russians were actually going to take Kiev and engage in urban combat and control it. There's a pretty straightforward way that they could take the east and the south, which is just destroy all the cities and fight in the field between the cities. And it's a horrible thing to do, but they did it in Syria, and they did it in Grozny in Chechnya in 1999, and Putin oversaw that. It was, you basically tell the cities, okay, you bombard the cities, including all the civilian areas, and then you say, okay, we're going to form a civilian corridor. So we're going to give the civilians 24 hours to leave. And then whoever leaves. And you say, okay, well, now all the civilians are out. And so by definition, everybody stays as a combatant. And then you just level it, and then you move in the troops. Is that going to work? I don't know, but I don't think we're anywhere close to Putin concluding it won't work. So unfortunately, I think the intensity of the fighting is going to increase. But, I don't know, the war has also been a whole bunch of surprises. So I think, I can imagine them making another move on Kiev at some point or something else. So, but, in the White House, they're trying to figure this very thing out, which is, what are the scenarios? How does this end? And, what are the sort of possible trade-offs here? I mean, the problem so far has been that, there's been these negotiations between Ukrainians and Russians, but they don't really mean anything. I really think the Russians are just kind of bluffing on this whole thing and trying to seem reasonable. There's really nothing to this, because the Russians aren't prepared to agree on anything because they think that this is ultimately going to swing in their direction. So what is the thing that Putin would accept, that Zelensky would accept, that would end the fighting? I laid out one scenario, but in order for them to accept that, they would have to go through a hell of a lot more fighting for that to look like the best possible option. And we're nowhere near that now. So, I don't know, is the short answer. That's a very long way of saying I don't know.
And lastly, just in closing, thank you again for what you do for the Center for New American Security. Incredible think tank, incredible array of experts. Much like the World Affairs Council, strongly bipartisan. We will host Democrats, we will host Republicans. I know a lot of ones who've worked on different administrations who are with you now. But the United States, we're kind of more dire times. We're in kind of, shadows of autocracy and threats of U.S. leadership kind of slipping are all over the place. We have parts of the American public that are happy to support someone younger, Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump to step back from the world stage. You worked for many, many years as senior advisor to Senator John McCain. I think, sadly, probably the last American to genuinely garner full respect and support from people from the left, from the right, from the middle. Do you see anyone in the future kind of that level? Or how can we as a country come together and realize, okay, I know there's domestic politics, but the threats from China, especially Russia to a degree, are a lot of is much more consequential than what we're talking about on Fox or on MSNBC or CNN.
Well, Putin has accomplished the impossible of bringing Republicans and Democrats together behind something. They don't like Russia, they do like Ukraine. So that's a start. You gotta take it where you can get it, right? And previously on China, that was the one issue that Republicans and Democrats could agree, and anything that sort of fell under the broad rubric of necessary to compete with China was starting to garner bipartisan support. I can say answer your question in a slightly different way maybe than you asked it, which is, it is easy to look across the world and say, oh my God, the world's in total disarray, and the Chinese are rising, and the Russians are violent, and we haven't talked about Iran or North Korea or the civil war in Ethiopia, or take your pick of the problem spots around the world. But I think there's a huge, unexpected, hopeful sign of what we've seen over the past 2 months. I mean, think about it this way. All these worries about, China is sometime soon going to overtake the United States as the world's biggest economy, ever more capable military, working with, if there are three great powers in the world, the United States, Russia, and China, we're one and they're two. That's, not a good equation. You want to be on one side of it and all this other stuff. Okay, all that's true. But in response to the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the West, which I would define not just as Europe and North America, but also countries with kind of Western style institutions, Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand and others, they all got together and they brought the Russian economy to its knees in 48 hours, and provoked a near default on Russian sovereign debt almost overnight. They were able to combine their power to restrict the flow of technology to Russia almost overnight. They have started flooding Ukraine with advanced weapons from more than 15 different countries. That is, a real game changer in the ability of the Ukrainians to defend themselves. The countries that are engaged in this activity represent well over half of global GDP, which dwarfs Russia and China combined. Their combined military might dwarfs China and Russia combined. Their numbers are a hell of a lot bigger in terms of the number of countries, and their diplomatic sort of throw weight is bigger. So it turns out that, the West has had all this power all along, all this capability, everything you would need to confront a threat or to compete effectively. It just wasn't really harnessing it well because we were so divided among ourselves and internally. We spent most of our time fighting with each other, or accusing allies of being bad allies, or whatever. But suddenly, in the face of this, it's the unity that has leveraged this power for a good end. Now, is that unity transferable to other issues? Does it last? I don't know, but I do think there's a learning process going on where countries, governments around the world are starting to wake up and say, actually, we have a hell of a lot more power than we thought we had. Maybe the day of the West is actually not done. Maybe the ascendance of China is not as certain as we thought. Maybe this autocratic axis of Russia and China is not as formidable as we thought. We're actually the strong ones. We just got to actually work together and have leaders who will march out in a positive vision. And if they can actually do that, then the world will be a much better place. And I think they can. Whether they will is another question. But the fact that we can is a pretty good starting point.
Thank you for a dark subject ending on such a hopeful note. And you all join me in thanking Richard Fontaine. We look forward to having you back. Thank you.